Now that it's become clear that carbon capture, utilization, and storage is going to be a part of Canada's response to emissions reduction, Energy Media has been doing a lot of interviews with global experts about various aspects of CCUS. I'm going to be talking to Francis Fong, who's a senior economist with TD Bank, about a paper they recently released about CCUS in Canada. So welcome to the interview, Francis.
Thanks for having me, Markham. Great to be here.
Now, what really struck me about your paper, the question that immediately sprang to my mind as I read it is CCUS a one-size-fits-all, or should CCUS be used more strategically so that we don't lock in industries, high-emitting industries, lock them in when we should be transitioning to other technologies? So maybe I'll get you initially just respond to that.
Absolutely. And I think the answer is, to your first point that, we would want to be a bit more discriminating here. It's important to note, I think, just to start off that, the IPCC, the IEA, IRENA, they all talk at length about the importance of carbon capture. The IEA estimates that we're going to have something like 7.6 gigatons of carbon that will need to be captured across a range of activities by 2050. But when they're talking about that, they're really only talking about 4 very limited uses for the technology. Point source capture in hard to abate heavy industry like cement or petrochemicals, direct air capture, bioenergy, and possibly a fourth being natural gas production for blue hydrogen as a transition towards green hydrogen. If we use that as a starting point for where CCUS is going to play a role kind of long term, then notionally it would be very discriminating in terms of where it gets used. The reason we wrote our report, and this is obviously a very contentious issue, is the question that's at top of mind for everyone is, can it be used today to reduce the emissions intensity of, for example, oil and gas production? So, let's get this out of the way, that CCUS should not be used as in any way to delay action on decarbonizing end-use services. But where we maybe diverge from the broader consensus is that we feel that CCUS can play perhaps a multitude of transitional roles as part of the clean energy transition.
And there's so much innovation taking place, and steel would be a very good example. Just a couple of years ago, steel was seen to be one of the leading sectors, one of the leading candidates for CCUS because it's hard to abate. And then all of a sudden, companies began to transition into electric arc furnaces and other technologies, coupled with renewable energy. So they had a clean source of electricity. And we saw the federal government put some money into a plant like that in Hamilton. And this seems to be a real trend now in steel. And it happened so quickly. It was almost, it was unexpected how rapid. And so CCUS, you build all of this infrastructure like pipelines, and you've got to put it under the ground and all of that. And then I think we have to worry that we build infrastructure that then becomes a stranded asset because there's a better technology comes along.
I think that's an excellent point. I think so the way I come at this topic is there's going to be at least some use of CCUS across some wide range of services. To your point, there's a lot of uncertainty as to how technology evolves, what will actually require CCUS, but by 2050, there's at least some notion that there's going to be a need for a wide application of CCUS technology. The challenge that I often think that net zero scenarios face is that there's this assumption of a gradual increase in scale of these kind of emerging technologies, particularly something like DACs, over time towards 2050, with perhaps less discussion of how we actually get that scale. And you and I both know, when we're talking about climate policy and abating emissions, scale is everything. If you can't scale it, it's going to be very difficult to actually find a role for it. An example here, we talk about EV adoption at length without often discussing or having a similar discussion about lifetime emissions, including deep decarbonization of mining or battery production, disposal, recycling, what have you. And I think CCUS is the same way. So while we want the focus to be on things like DACs and BECCS and point source capture for process emission, there's less discussion about how do we actually get the technology writ large to a point where they're actually at scale. And I think that's kind of the point of the report, is that we don't exactly know what CCUS applications will be needed, but we know we need to do work now to start developing the technology and scaling the market for it, so that when the applications actually do arise, like the need for the applications actually do arise, then there's been enough innovation in the sector to do that. Like we need to call a spade here. Like most carbon capture today is used for enhanced oil recovery, so it's not necessarily something that in its current kind of iteration is purely for a green purpose, but that could notionally set the groundwork for actually developing the technology that will be kind of helping to reduce emissions.
Well, here's an example that I've written about already, and that is the oil sands. So the oil sands net zero by 2050 pathways initiative, it's big, it's, $75 billion initiative proposed by industry. They want government to pay $50 billion of it. A lot of it will consist of CCUS. And so here's the question for me. If what you're doing is locking in, if you're putting in CCUS to extend the life of the oil sands as a feedstock for fuel, for liquid fuel, there's a very good argument to be made that market, global market, is going to be declining after 2030. And you could spend $50 billion of public money for an industry that is now a sunset industry, and all of that is stranded assets, or much of it is. Or you could pivot the oil sands over the next 30 years into producing bitumen for feedstock for materials like carbon fiber. Then now you've got an industry that could, if all it's doing is making, carbon fiber, it could extend into 2100, into the next century. It might have a long-term sustainable future. And it's those kind of strategic conversations that we're not having.
I completely agree with that statement. But I think one of the things, though, that we do need to put a bit of caution around is the rate at which we are decreasing our dependence on fossil fuels. To your point, we're going to see a lot of progress over the next 10 years, just simply as a function of a lot of the policy measures that we're talking about. The new sales mandate that came out of the emissions reduction plan, perhaps a hard cap on emissions in the oil and gas sector. All of these things can play a role in dramatically reducing fossil fuel dependence. But on the same token, we are heavily underinvesting across the board in renewable energy production. So if we kind of look at it in aggregate, there's still kind of a need to kind of produce energy writ large on this pathway towards decarbonization. And my concern, if we talk too much about kind of like reducing production, which is absolutely what we need to do to meet our emissions reduction target, it kind of, you're going to have this gap between supply and demand that's going to be difficult to meet. So the difficult conversation about this is this notion of stranded assets that you brought up. It's absolutely true. But I mean, at the end of the day, we need to be able to take that risk if we're going to reduce emissions today. Like, we need to meet our emissions reduction target by any means necessary if we're still going to have a chance at 1.5 degrees. And if this is one tool that we can use to do that, then I think the risk of stranded assets is one that we ought to take. To your point, I agree, locking in, not a great idea, but it also, and this is my personal perspective, is that it can't be kind of one or the other. It has to be all at the same time. So that shift in strategy that you talked about has to coincide, in fact, with reducing emissions in current oil and gas production until we're successful at decarbonizing end-use services.
Yeah, that's what I liked about your paper, is that there was a sense there of, your argument around we need to have this strategic discussion, because what we don't want to use CCUS, for example, to retard the development of innovative technologies. Where we get lazy. We slap we build a pipeline and we slap some CCUS gathering technology on source to get the CO2, and then we just carry on with the status quo. That's one of my big concerns about this, is that very often the industries that want to use it, it's just like, okay, government pays for all my infrastructure, and I can just carry on business as I've always done and make lots of money at it.
That's absolutely not the intent of our research either. And there's also an emerging body of evidence that's suggesting that carbon removals are not the same as kind of eliminating combusting fossil fuels in the first place. Like the impact is asymmetric on both sides, which means to really kind of have any chance of addressing climate change and not eating through our carbon budget, it has to come from reducing dependence on fossil fuels. So I completely agree with you.
So where do we go with this, Francis? Your paper calls for this bigger conversation, the strategic conversation. Where are we going to have that conversation?
That's a great question. I think it honestly, it starts with, I mean, I think we already started that conversation. Like if you look at the emissions reduction plan that was released on Tuesday, it's pretty clear that the government intends on kind of using all the policy tools at its disposal to immediately reduce emissions intensity and decarbonize end-use services. One of the really interesting things of all the measures, like nothing new was necessarily announced about the oil and gas sector. They pretty much reiterated the hard cap on emissions, reducing methane emissions that they did at COP26, and then reiterated the CCUS tax credit with no new details available. But one line really stuck out to me in the plan. They said, the intent of the hard cap, which notionally would be the most impactful immediately, the intent of the cap is not to bring reductions in production that are not driven by declines in global demand. That line really stuck out at me because if you combine that with the methane pledge, which I'm given to understand is feasible to meet that methane pledge given current technology to reduce fugitives, and the commitment to a CCUS tax credit, it's clear the government does not intend on using this policy as a binding constraint on production if efforts to decarbonize end-use services aren't successful. So instead, they're going to focus on demand-side measures to reduce dependence and notably and importantly, technological means to lower the emissions intensity of production, particularly with CCUS. So where do you go from here? I think we're going to start to have to talk about, to your point, building a lot of physical assets. Like there's a tremendous amount of infrastructure need that will be required to support a burgeoning CCUS industry. There's a project out of Princeton called Net Zero America that estimated 110,000 kilometers pipeline mileage would be needed to be built for CO2 to move where emissions are being produced to geological storage. That's the same amount of pipeline mileage that was built to support the entirety of the shale industry over the last 15 years. So that gives you the scope of how much actually needs to be built. And so I think work needs to start on actually getting those assets up and running.
I'm really glad you brought up the point, this issue that was raised in the emission reduction plan that was announced earlier this week, that the government is not looking at production cuts. And this has been a sticking point for the industry, the oil and gas industry in Alberta, for a long time. And the industry will. I wrote some columns about a deal that was struck between oil sands CEOs and environmental groups back in 2014, 2015, and it was explicitly the agreement was we will bend on things like carbon pricing and a hard cap on oil sands emissions in return for no production cuts. And this is important because if you look at the data, as long as production is rising, oil and gas emissions have never fallen, ever. Emissions intensity per barrel falls, but absolute emissions at best have leveled off. And so if production, which is scheduled to rise by production is scheduled to rise 900,000 barrels a day by 2030, that creates a real tension and stress within that policy framework and the government.
And then there's, I think, maybe some added elements to that conversation is one, the increased commitment to try to increase production to support Europe as they divert away from Russia. And two, I think one of the maybe unspoken things about this emissions reduction plan, it's clear they're going to focus on things like decarbonizing transportation and heavy industry and whatnot, and trying to reduce demand there so that in turn will lower production and emissions, to your point. But so much of our production is exported. Part of that is imported back as final products, as like propane and gasoline and things of that nature. But notionally, the demand declines that we would need to see to actually reduce production and therefore emissions don't even happen here. So we actually are depending on the US to make progress on their kind of transition away from fossil fuels in order to support our production decline. So there's I think a lot of kind of added complications of what you just described.
That's exactly right. And I guess while I'm sure the average Canadian does not want to delve into the complexities of this, at the same time, there has to be some kind of discussion at the national level so that this isn't just a really simplistic discussion.
Right.
Anyway, Francis, always appreciate talking to you, and thank you very much for your insights.
It's been a pleasure, Markham.